This is a continuation of my video on moral relativism and objectivism. And if you've not watched part one, you probably should do so, because I'm assuming some awareness of definitions of terms that I'm going to be using here. Also, it would be helpful if you watched the normative versus descriptive video prior to going further on this one. So in conversations, I've heard an unsophisticated defense of relativism. This is unfortunately fairly common, that people provide this kind of a defense of relativism. So the problem with this defense, I'll just say that up front, is they fail to distinguish between normative claims and descriptive claims. And as a result of that failure, they believe that if a culture or individual says that something is morally wrong, then it is, right? That's all there is to it, end of story. The same with something being morally right. If a culture endorses it, says it's morally right, then it is. That's all there is to it. It's right for them. No judgments on our part. But a question that challenges this belief, I think, is very clear here. Could the values that a culture endorses be different from what moral principles actually exist? Is it possible for a culture to say that something is morally good, morally right, morally permissible, when in fact that activity is morally wrong, maybe even morally reprehensible? And often when people provide that initial defense of relativism and they're asked this question, they will initially say, well, that's not possible, because relativism is committed to there being the same thing. And then when you raise examples, there are two responses, either confusion or a desire to end the conversation quickly. So it's kind of like an analogy. We'll talk about examples, by the way, in just a few more minutes into this video. But what I'm suggesting is that morality is analogous to more pragmatic concerns. So suppose somebody wants to lose weight, and one person chooses the approach of exercise, eating a healthy diet in moderation, and a second person chooses the approach of just going to eat anything and everything they want on one day, and then the next day they won't eat anything. And then they continue to cycle that pattern over and over. Now, clearly the first person is going to be better off, more healthy, more likely to lose weight than the second person. And it really doesn't matter what they believe. Right? It doesn't matter if the second person believes that that's the best way to be healthy and lose weight. It's just not the case. Right? I think morality is more like that, but many people do not. So let's consider some defenses of conventionalism and how philosophers defend conventionalism. First of all, there's this challenge that a conventionalist has that critics would raise. So you have these different cultures that do have different beliefs and practices, at least to a certain extent. So we have anthropologists gathering all this information that tells us that this is true. So why think that moral relativism, though, is the most plausible explanation of the diversity of moral beliefs and practices across various cultures? The relativist says that it is, right? That's the defense of conventionalism. It says, you know, conventionalism explains it the best. So the analogy with physical examples, again, might be the best defense. This is something done by Gilbert Harman. So he says, compare this idea of morality with this idea of motion. So consider the question whether the earth moves around the sun, or it's the sun that moves while the earth is still. It's a relativist. Now Harman says it really doesn't matter, right? There's no truth of the matter, and it's all relative because motion is relative. I think a better example might be for you're standing on the side of a highway and you see a car drive by and there's a passenger in the car. Now, To you, the car just drove by at 60 miles an hour, so that passenger is moving at 60 miles an hour. From your framework, the passenger is moving. Let's suppose the passenger's asleep at the time. For the driver's framework, the passenger is not moving, just completely still in their seat, no motion. If somebody asks, was he moving at all, for that stage of the trip? And the answer from the driver's perspective is no. So from one framework, the person's not moving. From another framework, the person is moving. So that's the appeal. And the idea from Harman is that morality is like that. There are just different frameworks. From one framework, something might be morally wrong, but in a different framework, something might be morally right. So it depends on, for your spatial physical examples, it simply depends on your spatial temporal framework. And that's the same as what's going on with moral principles. So this is the defense that Gilbert Harman provides, and it has much more rationality than the unsophisticated defense that we mentioned earlier. And so he says, look, conventionalism is the best explanation of this diversity. They're just simply different frameworks that we have, similar to different frameworks that we have with physical events like motion. Now, here's one concern with the motion analogy. Some people are not in a good position to judge. So, for example, the answer to whether the sun is moving around the earth or the earth moving around the sun. Well, 500, 600 years ago, prior to Copernicus and Galileo, everyone just believed that, of course, the sun was moving. It looks like it moves. We're stationary on Earth. You see the sun rise. You see the sun set. It's the sun that's moving. From that framework, it moves. Whereas the Copernican revolution came around and we realized that it's actually the Earth moving around the sun. So there is a good answer, though, right? Aren't we in a better position today than they were prior to around 1600? We in the 21st century are in a much better position to judge whether the Earth or the sun is moving than those people had 500 years ago. So it seems like a problem because of that. Here's another analogy with rain that sometimes theorists provide. So suppose it's June and it hasn't rained for a month, and a bride has an outdoor wedding plan and it rains. That's good for the farmer, but it's bad for the bride, right? And so maybe morality is like that. But the problem here is that the rain analogy is merely about preferences, what's to one advantage. But morality is more than mere preferences, right? Preferences have to do with things like, what do I want, chocolate or vanilla ice cream? Now, you can have very strong preferences. I prefer not to have a broken leg, right, than to have a healthy leg. They can be very strong. But morality is much more than that, right? It's not merely an expression of preferences, although some philosophers think it is. I don't think that's consistent with our beliefs at all. Other philosophers have made an analogy with etiquette, and I suggested that in part one of this discussion about relativism. So the idea is, if moral truths are relative to a culture like principles of etiquette, well, then no cultural standards of conduct are better than any others. That's the way it is with principles of etiquette. So some people eat rice with their hands, others with chopsticks, others with forks. It just depends on what your culture you're in. There's no right or wrong answer to it. There are no cultural standards of conduct that are any better than any others. There's no standard that says it's wrong, period, for all cultures to eat rice with their fingers. It just doesn't make sense. And morality is like that. That's the analogy. But some cultural standards of conduct are better than others, right? It is better to not have slavery. It's better to not treat women like some cultures do, under severe oppression, not allow them to drive or own property or get an education. So those things are, it's very different when we're talking about morality than when we're talking about etiquette. Moral truths are simply not relative to a culture. It just doesn't work. So the motivation for relativism, the more sophisticated arguments, fail. There are more direct arguments against conventionalism, and I'm going to use one from Louis Toyman regarding reform and reformers in particular. And so if moral truths are relative to a culture, which is what, of course, conventionalism endorses, then any person who tries to change cultural standards is going to be morally wrong in doing so, because they are going against the conventions, and the conventions determine what's morally right or wrong according to conventionalism. But moral reformers try to change cultural standards, but they are not morally wrong in doing so. For example, Martin Luther King Jr., in leading the civil rights movement, was trying to change cultural standards that didn't allow Black people in the United States to drink from the same water fountain sometimes, or have the same opportunity in education, or all kinds of different problems that he brought about and sought changes in. William Wilberforce, who was a strong leader in getting Britain out of the slave trade. Susan B. Anthony, who fought for a woman's right to vote. These people brought about significant changes in the cultural standards in which they lived. But according to conventionalism, they would be morally wrong in doing so. So, moral truths are not relative to a culture. We put those two premises together, we can draw this conclusion, which of course means that conventionalism is mistaken. Okay, against conventionalism, what about judgment? If moral truths are relative to a culture, then one cannot and should not judge the values of another culture. Now, most conventionalists obviously accept this. They say that's right, and that's an advantage of conventionalism. We don't want to do that. We should not do that. Who are we to judge what another culture does? You don't know what it's like to be raised in that culture. You shouldn't judge it. So the premise is endorsed by conventionalism. Here's the problem. We can and we should judge the moral values of people of another culture. We can and we should judge the Nazis. Right? It was morally wrong of them to gather up the Jewish people, put them in concentration camps, and kill over 6 million of them during World War II. That was morally wrong. The Indian practice of burning widows on the funeral pyre, when a married couple the husband died, the widow was burned. Now that was maybe a small practice in a limited area, but that was going on. And it was morally wrong for that culture to do so. And of course, we've already talked about slavery. Obviously, we can and we should judge the values of people of another culture. And by the way, of course, we should judge the values of our own culture. Right? We can make that judgment as well. Thus, moral truths are not relative to a culture. In conversations with conventionalists, I have heard people endorse the first premise, but yet they are very quick to judge their own culture, not understanding that conventionalism implies that you couldn't judge your own culture either, because there's no moral basis for doing so. The only moral values are those that are endorsed by your culture. So this is an argument that seems to follow pretty strongly against conventionalism. Here's another argument. Consider this thought experiment. So consider two different cultures, one in the United States in 2035 and another one in the United States in 2135. So let's imagine in 2035 in the United States, Women have all the opportunities of men, all the opportunities with education. They are equally represented in our government, in Congress. They are equally likely to be CEOs of a Fortune 500 company, and everything is equal, right? We get it right. All the opportunities are the same for men and women. Now, imagine that there is a group of men who are very resistant to the changes that have occurred, and they somehow get power, and what they start to do is, this is well into the future, genetically engineer all females that are born so that they will want to be subservient. They do some major behavioral programming, so to speak, of female infants so that they desire to be subservient to men. And this gets more broad spread, and they use power to enforce this change. And by 2135, all the women think that this is the proper role of women, to be subservient to men, so that men can treat them like property. Right? So in the second culture, the moral framework says that it's morally permissible to sell women on eBay. Right? They're treated like pets or something like that. Right? Now, clearly, this culture in 2135 is morally reprehensible. It's an outrage that it would happen. Right? But according to conventionalism, is one culture morally superior to another in its treatment of women? And the answer has to be no. If conventionalism is correct, neither culture is better than the other culture when it comes to the treatment of women, because the moral standards of the cultures endorse what is going on in the culture. So none is better. There's no standard apart from the culture by which you could make a judgment. But only an objectivist can say that the culture in 2135 is morally reprehensible. You have to be an objectivist in order to make that judgment. And I think that's a pretty darn reason to be an objectivist. Okay. Objectivism and absolutism. Let's make sure we're clear on the terms. I just said you had to be an objectivist. Absolutism is the view that there are non-overridable moral principles that are never to be violated. So under no circumstances do you violate, do you break, do you go against a moral principle. So there are some of these. Not every moral principle is like this, but absolutism says there are some that are like this. At least one. Objectivism can be defined in this way. There is at least one. There are some, we can say, universal objective moral principles that are binding on all peoples everywhere in some ideal sense. I'm borrowing Louis Toyman's definition here. He qualifies it in some ideal sense for objectivism. So what does that phrase, that qualifier mean? It means in certain circumstances, I'll edit that out. In certain circumstances, it may be defeasible. So for example, tell the truth is a moral value, right? And so in almost all situations, one should tell the truth. However, suppose you are in a situation where maybe in Nazi Germany, where you're hiding people from the Nazis, and they come to your door and they ask, are you hiding anyone? Well, to tell the truth would be the clear loss of life for the people you're protecting. So you have to decide which moral value are you going to follow. The one that says protect innocent people from great harm when it's in your power to do so, or the one to tell the truth. Now, it's only when there's another moral principle that is greater that you could violate the first one. So it is a moral principle that you ought to tell the truth at all times. However, There's this even more significant moral principle that you ought to protect innocent people from harm when it's in your power to do so. Especially the greater the harm, the more your responsibility to intervene. So this doesn't mean that the objective moral principles are absolute, like we just described, but they are there. So how would you argue for objectivism? Well, one way are the arguments that we just provided. Those are all reasons to reject relativism that leaves you with objectivism or absolutism. So there's an argument there. Here's an argument, again, I'm borrowing from Louis Toyman, his argument for objectivism. And he says, look, all you need to show that objectivism is true and relativism is false is for there to be just one universal moral principle that does not vary according to a culture or an individual. You just need to find one of these principles, and boom, you've got objectivism. And there are several such principles. So here are a few. It's morally wrong to torture innocent people for amusement. And here is the key. When I've said this in classes, I've had students raise their hand and say, well, what about the Romans, you know, and they at the Colosseum, and maybe they were torturing Christians and lighting them on fire for amusement, and all the people came to watch. It was great fun for them. And my response is, okay, that may have happened. Does that mean it was morally correct to do so? And I think any sane person would say, no, it's still morally wrong to torture innocent people for amusement, even if a culture does so. Here's another principle. Parents have a responsibility to care for their children. Right? It applies to all people at all times. Truth-telling is of great moral value. We already considered this. Now, keep in mind, right, if you're an objectivist, you say, well, there could be a situation where these principles might be violated, but only when there is another moral principle that is more important to follow. It's hard to imagine one for the first case. The second two possibly have exceptions that we could imagine. I already suggested one for the third. So it seems to be pretty clear that objectivism is correct. And yet, when you do surveys, relativism is by far the majority view among people. Why is that? Toyman has the explanation of this. He tries to explain the attraction of relativism in a few different ways. So one thing, he says, it's often presented as the only alternative to absolutism. So people don't like this idea of absolute moral principles that can never be violated in any way whatsoever. And so they go with relativism instead. But we've already seen that that's a false dichotomy. You might be an objectivist instead of an absolutist. So that's not a good motivation. Another motivation is that we've developed this heightened sensitivity over the last 30 years or so to ethnocentrism, the idea that one's own culture is morally superior to all the other cultures of the world. And so we have developed this sensitivity to this unwarranted intolerance of other cultures, right? So that seems to fit with moral relativism, right? We don't want to claim that our culture is superior to other cultures, so we just won't judge another culture at all. Whatever they say is morally right or wrong, we accept as morally right or wrong. Now, we've already talked through why that view is mistaken, and the fact that you don't have to be an ethnocentrist to judge other cultures. Keep in mind, you can judge your own culture according to objectivism, whereas you could not according to conventionalism. Finally, he mentions the decline of religion and associated religious values that are a coherent, broadly accepted group of principles in the culture, and so that is less pervasive than it once was. So there is less support for objective moral principles because of that decline of acceptance in our culture. Okay, so I've said a few times that it is okay to judge other cultures, that we ought to do so, that there are moral principles by which we can judge other cultures. But who's to judge what is right? So this is a common criticism to an objectivist. Well, who are you to say? Who are you to say that that culture is morally wrong? Who are you to make that judgment? Right? It's often a very pejorative claim. Now, here's Toyman's response. Who's to judge? We are. Right? We should discover objective moral truths. And we can find out this. It's similar to what happens after death. So maybe we can't know, but there is a fact of the matter. So even if no one knows, you still have to live your life in a certain way. Right? And there is a fact of the matter. The difference, though, is that we do have a capacity to know moral truths. It might be somewhat mysterious, and personally, I think this capacity is given to us by God, although you certainly don't have to be religious to be an objectivist. But we have this internal capacity to identify moral truths. Now, one word of caution here, right? This doesn't give everyone a free license to make all these moral judgments and think they're just right, right? We should make moral judgments only after we've considered things very carefully, after we've listened to other perspectives. We should do it with empathy for those who disagree with us, right? And Toyman includes all of those suggestions in his writings. We should do so with empathy, with awareness of other people's perspective. And it's only after that that you can have a grounding for making moral judgments. Only after you've thought it through carefully. So, but how can we know moral principles? Well, you can't appeal to science. That's really clear. I mean, science can tell us how to make a nuclear weapon, but not whether or not we should use it, or how to clone a human being, but not whether or not we should do so, right? We may not be able to provide a good argument for basic moral principles, even if we know them, but that's okay, right? You believe all kinds of things that science and good arguments cannot prove, but you still have good reason to believe them. And this goes on to a controversial issue in epistemology, I confess that, and hopefully I'll make a video on epistemology on this topic. But there are a lot of beliefs that you have that can't be proven by science, and you can't even provide a good argument for them. So, for example, the principle of non-contradiction, the most fundamental principle of reasoning, right? Science can't tell us that that's true, and you can't have a good argument for it because all good arguments depend on its truth. What you ate for breakfast yesterday or 3 days ago, science could not tell that. If you were to pass away, they couldn't find it out from an autopsy. And you may not be able to provide any good argument, right? If a person is skeptical about what you say, there's no argument that you can provide that would convince people that that's true. So, but you know it's true, right? So I know that I had some egg whites and Wheaties for yesterday, but I can't prove it, and I can't give you a good argument. You also believe that your senses are reliable. Now, again, this gets into some interesting concerns about epistemology, but science can't prove that our senses are reliable. Why? Because we have to use our senses to do science. You can't prove your senses are reliable. Why? Because you have to use your senses to try to do so. So we believe things that we can't have good arguments for, that science can't prove. Moral principles are one of those areas. Again, it doesn't mean we should not reflect carefully, think through and consider carefully what moral principles are correct and what are not. But this is something that we have, and the objectivist is very comfortable with this idea that we have a capacity to judge and understand what moral principles are right and what moral activities are wrong.